morning and welcome to the public hearings of the Media and Digital Platforms Market Inquiry. I am James Hodge, Chair of the inquiry in my role as Chief Economist and Acting Deputy Commissioner of the Competition Commission, and I'm joined by my fellow panel member and media industry veteran, Paula Frey. Please refer to us as James and Paula throughout these proceedings. We are supported by a highly experienced technical team led by Nolutando Jukazi and Donovan Lindley. And that team includes Patutsetso, Manenze, Apiwe Nanto, Mkisa Jordan, Sivuyise Mtiki, Kukle Majola, Songezo Mabete, and Chandra Prince. And we are also supported by cadets Nonelelo Vuba and Bandile Bekiswayo. The inquiry was initiated to examine the distribution of media content on search and social media digital platforms, AI chatbots, and the assisted search, and also the advertising technology or ad tech markets that connects advertisers and news publisher websites. The purpose is to determine throughout this inquiry if there are any market features that may be adversely affecting competition or undermining the purposes of the Competition Act, and then to comprehensively remedy those features that we find to be harming competition. The focus of that impact being on the media industry in South Africa. The inquiry was launched last October and has already gathered extensive information from a wide range of industry stakeholders, from submissions made to the statement of issues, further statement of issues, and requests for information to both digital platforms and the media and some of the supporting industries. The public hearings will present another opportunity for stakeholders to not only provide their perspective on some of the issues identified by the inquiry to date, but also for the panel to discuss and debate with stakeholders those perspectives, as well as some of their business models. Public hearings do play a critically important role in market inquiries to ensure transparency and accountability before the public, not only for the inquiry, but also the stakeholders that come before the inquiry. The panel welcomes the participation by a broad range of South Africa's mainstream media, community media, vernacular media, radio and television broadcasters, including the public broadcaster and community broadcasters, some of the largest global search and social media platforms which are also at the forefront of AI, ad tech companies, ad brokers, media associations, think tanks, and academics. The only global major platform that has so far refused to participate in this hearings is X Corp, formerly Twitter, represented by ENS. The panel does not find this position acceptable, as it denies us the ability to discuss and debate the submissions made by X Corp, and it denies the South African public and the media that transparency and accountability which is so important. We also find it somewhat ironic that X has taken this position, given its own value proposition to users, which it describes as a real-time, global, open, public conversation platform where people can see every side of a topic, discover news, share their perspectives, and engage in debate and discussion. The panel would like to hear from the public and the media on whether you think X Corp should be participating and what questions you have for them of relevance to the inquiry scope. You can do so on any of the social media platforms or directly, and please use hashtag MDPMI. With those opening remarks, we now proceed to open the public hearings. Our first participant and stakeholder is a set of media associations, the South African National Editors Forum, SANEF, the Press Council of South Africa, the Association of Independent Publishers, the Forum of Community Journalists as well. They will be followed by the International Fund for Public Interest Media, and we'll close at 1 today. But tomorrow we commence with Media 24, followed by MoneyWeb, the Washington-based Center for Journalism and Liberty, and then the Gibbs Media Leadership think tank in the afternoon. The full schedule for this week is available on our website and also social media. So maybe without further ado, Zbu, do you want to introduce your team and also those who've come in support that might speak as well? and we can then proceed to your presentation.
Thank you very much, James. Good morning to everyone. I do have a team that came with here, but we also did prepare the manner in which we'll present things. So if you'll allow me, let me have my colleague Michael introduce the rest of the team. Thanks.
Chairperson Hodge, Ms. Frey, and members of the technical team and the Commission. My name is Michael Power from ELT Advisory, and I've been asked by SANEF partners to facilitate today's conversation. I'm joined by Sibungo Ngawa, the chairperson of SANEF, the editor-in-chief of Eyewitness News, and the Treasurer General of the newly reconstituted African Editors Forum. I'm also joined by Guy Berger, the former Director for Freedom of Expression and Media Development at UNESCO, the former head of the School of Journalism at Rhodes University, and presently active. We will jointly present SANEF's oral submission. In addition to the three of us, we are joined by Glenda Daniels, the Secretary General of SANEF, Isak Minar, the Chair of SANEF's Access to Information and Media Policy Subcommittee. Mr. Minar is also acting as a representative of the Press Council of South Africa and as a representative of the Association of Independent Publishers. We're joined by Reggie Moalusi, the Executive Director of SANEF, and by Chris Msinga, a member of AIP and the manager of SANEF's Community Media Digitization Drive. Chairperson, as a point of departure, as you will note from the three previous submissions that SANEF and others have filed, other partners who endorsed SANEF's previous submissions, such as Media Monitoring Africa, SOS, and the Gibbs Media Leadership Think Tank, while remaining supportive of SANEF's position in this inquiry, have elected to present their own oral submissions, and as a result, they are not present here today. Chairperson, in terms of housekeeping, we have handed up to the Chair our oral note for submission, and we have prepared an oral presentation by way of PowerPoint for today. There are two minor matters which just seek correction, and if I can refer the Chair to paragraph 57.1 of our written note. Chairperson, at the fifth line of paragraph 57.1, there is a minor typographical where it says that news media carry and they do not adequately. That's the first. The paragraph 69. It's on page 26. And it's the second last line where it should read AI generated as opposed to generated AI.
Thanks, Michael, and we'll make this available on our website for the public hearing so others can also engage with it.
Thank you. Turning then to an overview of our presentation. Chairperson, as noted in SANEF's initial submission on the draft terms of reference, SANEF notes that the growth of digital platforms in recent years has had a detrimental effect on traditional revenue streams for news media organizations. As a result, SANEF and its partners appreciate the importance of this process to create an efficient and fair market in which diverse and alternative routes for the sustainability of journalism can be pursued. Importantly, this inquiry has the potential to play a significant role in interrogating the interaction between digital platforms and news media organizations. And SANEF notes that these types of processes have already taken place in various other jurisdictions, including Australia, Canada, the European Union, and the United Kingdom. This inquiry thus paves the way in establishing such investigations in South Africa and on the African continent, and setting a precedent of accountability over the digital platforms in Global South and global majority countries. As such, SANEF and its partners welcome the opportunity to continue to participate in this process. For today's purposes, Chairperson, Ms. Frey, I will address the inquiry on the first two questions that were asked in the invitation letter to SANEF, being constitutional rights and access to credible news, and thereafter competition between foreign news media and South African news media organizations. I'll then hand over to Mr. Ngalwa to address trends in news media and revenue generation for news media, and consumer choice and the participation of SMEs and HDPs in the online distribution of news. Thereafter, Mr. Berger will take us through the impact of dis and misinformation, and with leave of the chairperson, we seek to introduce two additional topics for conversation. The first being the need for transparency in data and advertising, and the second is generative AI as a complicating element for media organizations. Chairperson, if I then may turn to our first point for presentation, and that's constitutional rights and access to credible news. For reference of the panel, we're at paragraph 5, page 4 onwards of our written note. Chairperson, the importance of the media to our constitutional democracy cannot be gainsaid. Our constitutional court has held that the constitutional importance of the media in a democratic society is central to our constitutional dispensation. In recent jurisprudence from the Constitutional Court in Amabungane, the court went further to note that the Constitution thus asserts and protects the media in the performance of their obligations to the broader society, principally through the provision of Section 16. So, Chairperson Ms. Frey, when looking at the Section 16 rights which underpin this present inquiry, the media has two obligations. One, it is protected in and of itself through the constitutional provisions of press freedom, and it equally acts as a safeguard and an allowance in the distribution of information and ideas to the public. So the defense of media is simply not for media alone. It is also to foster the free flow of information ideas in a democratic state. Chairperson, we then note that in the further statement of issues which was presented by this inquiry, and following reference to the Mediclitic judgment of the Constitutional Court, the Commission has noted that there is therefore no question that the interpretation of the Act, including the market inquiry provisions, must promote constitutional rights. Chairperson, in our note we have detailed the interpretive scheme through which we suggest that this inquiry should consider the relevant provisions of the Competition Act, and we suggest for present purposes it's not necessary to take the Commission through that scheme. However, we do seek to note the 7 constitutional rights which are applicable to the present inquiry. The first being the right to freedom of expression, which includes freedom of the press and other media, and this is inasmuch as it pertains to public interest media and an effective and quality news media ecosystem in South Africa. The second is the right to access information as it pertains to the impact of social media platforms on the economic viability and prominence of credible news as an essential component of a democratic society and effective participation in economic life. The third is the right to language and cultural participation, which we hope to develop in further conversation during today's presentation. This pertains simply to media diversity and plurality and the centrality of community media in ensuring language diversity and media outcomes. The fourth, is the right to equality as it pertains to the ability for people to discover and access credible information across various divides, such as language, gender, class, and region. Fifth is the right to human dignity, as it pertains to, among others, algorithmic content recommendations, which undermine individual agency and choice. The sixth is the rights of the child and the right to education, as it pertains to the impacts of mis and disinformation, which we will hear more about a bit later, and the right to access both formal and informal basic and further education. And then lastly, the right to privacy, as it pertains to the obligation on digital platforms to protect personal data, which is not a legitimate reason to avoid providing access to anonymized or other data, such as to journalists and advocacy groups, when there is a public interest, and the access is both proportionate and necessary in a determined context. So, Chairperson, Ms. Frey, members of the technical team, in sum, this Commission invokes 7 of our 27 substantive rights in our Bill of Rights. This is no small feat. It constitutes over 25% of the actionable provisions within our Bill of Rights. And we have submitted both in SANEF's draft submissions on the draft terms of reference, in its submissions on the statement of issues, and in its submissions on the further statement of issues, that the Constitution, and particularly the allowance of press freedom, underpin and are at the heart of this inquiry. Chairperson, if I can then turn to Section 2. And this was a question in the invitation letter to SANEF around competition between foreign and South African news media. Chairperson Ms. Frey, this is not something that SANEF and its partners have addressed at this stage. It's not something that SANEF saw relevant at the earlier stages of this process. And while SANEF may be in a position to provide further written submissions on these particular questions with leave of this inquiry, we would welcome, during the Q&A session after this presentation, a conversation as to the relevance of these particular questions in as much as they pertain to digital platforms and media organizations. With that then, Chairperson, I turn to hand over to Mr. Ngolwa to address Section 3 and 4 of our note.
Thank you very much, Michael. I hope I'm audible. Good morning once again, Chair, and Paula, and the rest of the Commission. I'll deal with the part which deals with trends in the media and also the role that the media plays in this country and its importance in our democratic space. I think, as Michael said, we will not go through bit by everything on our submission, but just highlight the salient points as per the presentation. The one thing that we want to point out here, and I think this is also made in the draft terms of reference to this Commission, where we talk about the fact that informing the citizenry is a key role of news media organizations, and which we believe is also crucial in equipping citizens with necessary information and the tools they need to exercise and also vindicate their rights. And we also draw the attention to the crucial link between journalism as a public good and the need for public interest content that serves the needs of society. The other point that we make is actually the undeniable fact that an effective and a quality information ecosystem, which is enabled by the news media, is in the best interest of all society, including both public and private interests. And we talk a lot about news as a public good and public interest journalism. And I think it's important, just for purposes of this Commission, to go through those concepts a bit, which I will do. And the point we are emphasizing here is that journalism as a public good, alongside the need for public interest content, serves our society and the sustainability of the news media. So when we talk of public interest journalism in South Africa, we talk about journalistic activity that is central to the democratic function and the protection and promotion of the South African Constitution, including investigative journalism, and this also includes reporting on the public life of society. And I know that in different parts of the world, there are different interpretations or definitions of public interest journalism, but all of them pretty much point to the importance of investigative journalism and also reporting on public life. And I think that we capture as SANEF. The other interesting, important point to make out here is that we believe that high quality, credible and accessible news is a public good, and it actually directly serves the public interest in democracy and sustainable development. And the point about media being a public sentinel is actually a point which we make very strongly, and also it was made by the courts in the famous Print Media and Another versus the Minister of Home Affairs, where in that ruling it was said, and I read, in considering the comprehensive quality of the right to freedom of expression, one also cannot neglect the vital role of a healthy press in the functioning of a democratic society. One might even consider the press to be a public sentinel, and to the extent that laws encroach upon press freedom, so too do they deal a comparable blow to the public's right to a healthy, unimpeded media. And I think that point best encapsulates that sentiment, Chairperson, and also as my colleague so eloquently put it earlier on. Now, as a point of departure, the reality here is that we live in a South Africa which is diverse in terms of language, culture, politics, and identity. So the issue of media diversity is a crucial component for us. Is a crucial component of press freedom. And we know that South Africa is also a country with high inequality in terms of race, class, and gender. So it is important for us that the media represents different people and voices, and that it helps guarantee that a plurality of national and local news and viewpoints and interests are represented in the public media. And that includes also those views that are not normally aired through your mainstream news channels. But we do know, Chairperson, that media diversity in this country has not reached that point. And we do know that most newsrooms are located in urban centers. And we do know that most of the mainstream media caters for the English and the Afrikaans market to the neglect of the rest of the languages in this country, notwithstanding the fact that the majority of the people in this country speak the vernacular languages. I will turn briefly to some of the we did a study in 2020 which was chaired by Judge Kathy Satchwell, and it came back, we had a volume of about 300 and so pages, but I just want to touch on a few of the findings that were made in that inquiry that I think are relevant to today. And one of the points that Judge Satchwell and her panel, consisting of Rich Mkondo and our former colleague Nigwe Bigicha, it found that the and I quote, the oligopoly and lack of diversity persist, narrowing the public space for access to information and debate in a socio-political and economic landscape where English and Afrikaans dominate all platforms. Paywalls encroach, data is expensive, and online access is limited. And I think that paragraph best encapsulates the South African reality when it comes to access to media. And the other point that we make, and I think it's important for the Commission to take this into consideration, is that there's been a tendency by tech companies to, in terms of when they're negotiating these media bargaining code type of models, that they actually speak to your established media organizations. And I think in South Africa it's no different. Where and the danger of that is that you speak to a traditional media, which in this country we know, given our inequalities, is mostly English and Afrikaans, to the exclusion of the rest of the community media sector and also media that covers the news in the vernacular languages. So, and we've seen this in the Australian example, and I think that is something that is important for this commission, for this inquiry to note. So, and I think it's also important to note that when we're talking about the system in which news publishers could be rewarded or benefited by platforms, normally that's done looking at their online traffic. It's like the more hits you've got, the more money you get. Now, if you consider the very point I make about the disadvantaged position that a community media and vernacular media in this country have, and also given the fact that we know that these AI tools and these algorithms, they pretty much mirror the biases and also the skills, the skills of the very I would say, experts who put them together, and those biases actually do filter through. Now, if you use that model in the South African context, that then means that if you're going to go on clicks and online traffic, that then means there's a whole host of media that will be excluded from that. So I think that's an important point for this commission to look at. Now, when we get to the issue of fair compensation, we make this point, and that's also in this submission, that the fair compensation to us should be based on the value that the platforms derive from the content. And also we believe that small and local community media organizations should be enabled to participate and benefit from these systems. But the reality is that we don't know what that value is, because the tech companies do not provide that information. And if you read a recent piece, I think it's by MoneyWeb, it actually talks about the stalemate between South African publishers and and Google in this instance. And it's also around the issue of around fair compensation, if I may add. So as a result of this non-transparency, then we have a news media that does not have a clear indication of what is required for optimal advertising performance and revenue, nor to the user data that allows the successful targeting of an advert's intended audience. Now, that's why we have seen in countries like the United States, there was research that was done which actually kind of captured or calculated what they believe is fair value for this content. And I know that in Switzerland, the same happened, where that study came out, I think, saying that 40% of the revenue that I think Google generates in that jurisdiction is from news content. And I think that it would be prudent that as South Africa, we have a similar study that looks at what we regard to be fair value in terms of what news publishers ought to be receiving for the content that actually is used on these various platforms. And then, Chairperson, if I can turn to the issue of community media. I think I've made a few points around the history of this country and also the importance of community media. And I reiterate this point that for us, media diversity is crucial to media freedom and development. And we believe that the community media sector and the SABC are actually central to fostering media diversity and plurality in this country, Chairperson. And we've seen, once again, that retreat to urban centers, and we've seen most newsrooms actually, because of the cash crunch and the reduced revenue, they've actually closed bureaus in most of the remotest areas in this country, which is to the disadvantage of the communities that live there. That is why then an SABC, which has a language offering, and also community media sector that also covers some of the indigenous languages, is important to be prioritized going forward. And the other important point is that, I mean, we do have, you know, that for most of community media, it actually we worked as a training ground for young journalists, and they would go there after school to work in these community media organizations before they, for lack of a better word, graduate to mainstream newsrooms. So there's also a threat to sustainability and also the throughput of journalism when we have a weak community media in this country. And I think the need for content in local languages has the potential to provide a greater value to these platforms and their users, and that it should be prioritized as a matter of public good, Chairperson. And I think we actually did a test just to see how much these platforms, particularly Google, responds to, or how much content they have in indigenous languages. And we searched for the mayor of Moses Kotane municipality in Setswana, and we only came up with 3 responses, and none of them were accurate. And I think that's just one example, and it's also something that further highlights the importance of these platforms taking this content seriously. And as I wrap up, Chairperson, the number of questions that persist, and we've put them in the submission, that we believe that would help us better understand how these big tech, or particularly Google, relates to community media. And those questions are on the platform, on the submission. I will not go through them, Chairperson, in the interest of time. And with that, let me thank you and hand over to Prof.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Chair. Good morning, Ms. Frey.
I think we're losing on the James and Paula front.
Okay. Good morning, James and Paula. It's a pleasure to be here as a founder member of SANEF, and particularly to see SANEF also championing community media. I was a board member of the MDDA some years ago, and that is an issue that's close to my heart also. Throughout most of my life, I've been a digital champion, so my remarks are not coming from the position of a Luddite who is just wanting to go back to the smell of newsprint, as nice as that is. I worked at UNESCO the past 11 years, and there I was championing press freedom, pluralism, particularly in the communication sector, media development, access to digital opportunity. So publications, this one I did since I left UNESCO. It's called Platform Problems and Regulatory Solutions, for which I had to read more than 800 studies and other documents. This one here I worked on when I was still at UNESCO. This is called Finding the Funds for Journalism to Thrive. And more recently, I did this one, Data Sharing to Foster Information as a Public Good, the case of media viability and safety of journalists in the digital ecosystem. So I think it's not immodest if I say I think I'm an expert on these issues. To take you through some of the remaining parts of our oral submission, which see number 5 over there, which is dealing with this information. Just go to the next slide also. The additional matters, the question of transparency, data access, and then the generative AI. I'm not going to go through step by step, because actually you have the written version of the oral submission, and you have, I think, 150 pages in the earlier submissions by SANEF and partners. So what I want to do is really just present some of the thematic threads that give a cumulative case about the problems of the current setup, and the distinctiveness that SANEF is asking for different areas, the different distinctive areas of redress that SANEF is asking the Competition Commission to look at. So to kick off with, I think it is a truism in these quarters to say that competition is a valued goal, but it's not an end in itself. It's a mechanism that's used by society to achieve results of value to the society and to fend off concentrations of power, because concentrations of power are a means for the abuse of power. Competition, therefore, is not in isolation of its impact in the state of competition, in isolation of its impact on the wider constitutional and societal dispensations. Now, what one sees in the SANEF submissions is a discussion of competition in two markets. The first is the market for attention, and the second is the market for advertising. These are distinct but often interrelated markets, and now we have a third emerging market, and that is the market for content generation through generative AI. But I'm going to focus initially on these first two markets. So the market for the competition for attention is also competition for the hearts and minds of people. And the second one, of course, is competition, as has been mentioned, in advertising revenue, which is often a function of the attention economics vis-a-vis the different sub-markets for which you are trying to get advertising to reach. So the competition for attention, to go back to that first market, it's analogous, I think, in some ways to competition in other sectors, that there should be boundaries in this competition for attention. So, for example, those who are selling sugar or alcohol or tobacco, it can't just be competition of free for all to the bottom, a race to the bottom. We do have safety rails in this society that are imposed by the state. And if some companies in the spaces of sugar, tobacco, and booze subvert these legal strictures and get dominant market status as a result, then that dominant status is certainly not legitimately obtained. And the Competition Commission, in such a case, would need to assess complaints about dominance with regard to the means by which that dominance was achieved. In the attention markets, we need to ask, how was dominance achieved? So that is what I'll come back to in a second, a very key question. In the second market, the competition for advertising mirrors much of the market in the competition for attention, because the competition for attention is not detached from competition for advertising. Those with commercial interests who want to win the maximum advertising revenues face the need to win relevant segments of the attention economy. Dominance in the attention economy is a surefire way to get dominance in the advertising economy. Now, of course, competition is always about who wins and correlatively who loses. The problem arises not with that, but when the winners get bigger and bigger, and when nobody has a chance to challenge them. And history shows that a monopoly in the economic sphere or the political sphere is not good for society. Now, compounding the contemporary situation is that some of the same players in the attention market are also dominant in the advertising market. So they control the major means of communication in the attention economy. They optimize network effects and user lock-in to do so. And then, in parallel, they also control the mechanisms of digital advertising. What makes this particularly risky is that some of these companies are in the hands of individual tech barons. Obviously, people like Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, these are people whose sole decision can impact both these markets enormously, as indeed we can see just by cursorily following the news. And that can have huge consequences on the information ecosystem. Once again, I want to say the issue is not that there's competition and some are winning, it's the extent to which dominance in both these areas has been possible, that it has grown in such a way that there is a problem there. Now, although these big tech companies say that there is competition in both markets, this is quite open to challenge. In social media, for example, they sometimes point to the rise of TikTok. But TikTok has only come onto the scene through incredible amounts of capital investment, way beyond what most entities can ever assemble. So TikTok is not an illustration of competition per se. Second of all, far from competing with TikTok in innovative ways, one finds that Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube are simply imitating the formats of TikTok. You only have to look at Reels, for example, to see that. It's also well known that these big companies, in fact, I'm not making a moral case, it's in the nature of mega companies that get complacent, they've used their general resources not to innovate, but to buy up others in the whole system. WhatsApp was a standalone company, it's now owned by Meta. Instagram was a standalone company, now owned by Meta. The startups in the ad tech sector were bought by Google. Google itself bought YouTube. These are not results of innovation coming from it. These are because they just consolidated their position even more. So this is not exactly evidence of big tech aligning with a key purpose of competition, which is to foster innovation. Now today we do see a further dynamic with both Google and Meta investing in generative AI business. Again, they are copying ChatGPT run by OpenAI and other companies. and services. So in that marketplace, again, we don't necessarily see a lot of innovation. Anyway, to return back to the first two markets, I'll come later to this third market of the AI, generative AI business. The first two markets, let me use an analogy here. Imagine if the manufacturers of heavy-duty trucks in South Africa were to incrementally, over 5 years or 8 years, were to face competition from an importer who was able to undercut them through various measures. For example, by presenting the levels of pollution emissions as being less than it actually is. Or by installing poor quality or zero safety belts and safety bags in those vehicles. Imagine further that this importer then was able to buy up the distribution chain for petrol and give preferential treatment to its own trucks. I think at that point we would say that this has reached a point of domination as a result of unfair competition. Of course now, to move from the analogy to where we are, one can point to the costs incurred by news media in generating content, which puts them at a disadvantage vis-a-vis social media and search, which have found ways to make money out of content they don't have to pay for. One could perhaps say kudos to big tech for discovering this. But if we dig a bit deeper, we can see a few problems. News producers are legally liable for the content they produce. But if you're big tech, you can dodge any responsibility, for example, for disseminating defamation, because you simply say it's third-party content. It's not yours, and you have no responsibility for what gets distributed through you. And this is even though you make some money out of such content, and even though you don't just carry it like a postal service delivering it, your algorithms may well be amplifying that content. And at the same time, your quality controls are minimal at best. In the case of X, your quality controls are more or less non-existent these days. In contrast, of course, news media in this country are legally liable even for readers' letters and for posts on news media websites. This costs money, of course. So while news media have to spend money on content generation and ensuring its legality, the platforms do not have the same burden of liability. We often hear from the platforms that they do spend some money on quality control, and they like to cite what they call prevalence metrics. Prevalence is how much bad content they caught by human or automated means, and what they show is a relatively small percentage of their total users who saw this content. But the same metrics don't show the actual engagement with that content, which is, of course, key, how much people are liking, sharing, commenting on it, and so on. And they don't show further, even if it's a small out of the total distribution of this content, which is risky to women, for example, or which is reaching vulnerable people like teenagers who are vulnerable to body image content. So the way that platforms say they're doing quality control and the metrics they present are particularly configured to suit their interests and don't give you the whole picture. So the SANEF submission is requesting the Competition Commission to impose some requirements on big tech as a redress, so that big tech should properly spend on quality assurance on their platforms. And it's not enough to hope that they will just do this out of their own ethics. It needs to be part of their costs of doing business in South Africa. And of course, transparency is essential to verify that they are doing what they claim to be doing. Now, to the extent that issues such as imposing some obligations on the cost of business on these platforms may go beyond the Competition Commission authority, I'm not sure to what extent you can impose a duty of care on these companies which have unfair advantage. But to the extent it goes beyond your authority, or part of it, there's nothing to stop you, the Competition Commission, from recommending actions to other regulatory authorities or to Parliament, which can help address this very unequal playing field where news has one hand tied behind its back and the platforms have both hands free. let me move on, because at the same time, SANEF and partners also raise another distinctive point of redress in relation to a problem. And this is because it's one thing to have the platforms doing a better job of weeding their patch. That's a start. But weeding doesn't mean that nutritious crops will automatically flourish in that space. In fact, because of their negative externalities of their content, platforms' mode of business needs to be evaluated in terms of whether or how they contribute or not contribute to democratic and economic life in South Africa. It is the case that platforms facilitate social and family ties and cohesion. Yes, they provide diversion and entertainment. Yes, they contribute to some economic transactions, and a few offer revenue sharing options to content providers. But all of this needs to be weighed against the negatives, because it's not just a case of the positives versus the negatives and you weigh them up, because the negatives can actually undermine the positives. In the USA, you had social media promoting Black Lives Matter. Very good. But the same social media was implicated in an insurrection that nearly overturned the US election. So, an insurrection would have overturned any gains in the Black Lives Matter. So you have to see that the dangers can easily outweigh and undercut the benefits. In fact, the benefits even need to be discussed, because much as social media does promote social communications, its algorithms are also well known to promote polarization, even within families. So I won't go into it now, but there's a lot of evidence on that. It may well be that Facebook Marketplace is a good service, but it's also a site of fraud, and people are being killed by following up on Facebook Marketplace. So these are serious questions that need to be looked at. What is the contribution here of this big tech? And the particular issue that SANEF is signaling is that news media at all levels, from the community to the national, experiences disadvantage in disseminating news on these services. Now, I'll come to the issue of whether platforms pay something to news producers. That's a third issue I'll come to. But for now, the point is that even if they were paying or were not paying, they still should be considering a fair showing for news on their services. So instead of their algorithms promoting and recommending other kinds of content, we do see that in many cases they are actively demoting news. And again, the evidence is clear on this. The SANEF submissions have spelt out this is especially harsh for the local and community media in indigenous languages, meaning that the playing field for them is more akin to facing the Drakensberg from the lowlands and figuring out how the hell anybody up there will ever see you and discover you down there, how your content will ever scale the plateau. What if you're a woman startup media in the space? What obstacles will you face there? So the point is that news media, and particularly small media and newcomers, are blocked from growing, from creating jobs, and from contributing that sphere of information into the ecosystem, because the dominant players in the ecosystem are not interested in that kind of content. Okay, so far I've covered 2 points. The one is the skew that exists between the obligations and the costs of the platforms on one hand and the news producers on the other hand. And I've touched now on the way that the platform business models are deleterious in their effects on society and on news producers, especially those news producers who are upcoming. Now, it should not be beyond the resources of big tech to find a business model that would actually be more pro-news than it is at the moment. So that is, I think, what SANEF is asking for there also, a reconsideration of the business model. To move to the third area now, I'll come to this question of money. Because even though big tech, social media, and search are increasingly unfavorable to news, this kind of content is still helping them to make money. I mentioned the Canada case where Meta blocked news, but users in Canada have found workarounds because they want to see news, circulate news, talk about news on Meta platforms there. And more illustratively, one just has to look at TikTok, which is self-proclaimed entertainment platform. Well, you just look at, first you find countless people talking about issues in the news. That is, amidst the profitable ads that TikTok shows, almost every 5 videos, there's an advert. So they're making money. There's political content that's coming from news on their platforms, but they say that this is not something that merits them recompensing. So the problem is not only that people don't get access to the original news reports, but that the enterprises that are doing the hard work of news gathering, verifying, editing, and packaging the news cannot do so indefinitely without receiving any financial support from those who make money thanks to this work. Last week, you will have seen that the venerable Weekend Post newspaper serving Gqeberha closed shop. In the preceding weeks, we've seen more retrenchments at major South African media companies. So the overall slide is really continuing in news media. The point is that many countries have measures to ensure a flow of value to rebalance things here. Here, as everybody knows, commercial broadcasters have to pay a levy to the Media Development and Diversity Agency. In the USA, the cable TV industry has to fund the information channel C-SPAN. There are many different mechanisms that are being applied to the platform news-publisher relationship. Last week, Indonesia just announced a new one, compulsory bargaining code overseen by an independent committee there. So this is stuff that South Africa is not exceptional by looking at these issues. So let me come now to the fourth issue, and then I'll start wrapping up. The submission by SANEF and its partners deals with ad tech. As has been said, transparency is needed here to establish exactly whether we have gatekeeper price gouging and self-preferencing. And we need to also know how much of ad tech is funneling fake news websites. Just yesterday I was listening to a podcast about fake obituary websites that have a lot of Google automated advertising on them. So they create any obituary, people hear about it and they click on, they go to that, and it's indexed on Google. So not only for discovery, but in terms of the monetization of those websites. So I've looked at, just to repeat, unequal conditions in the attention marketplace, inhospitable the nature of these gatekeepers to the distribution of public interest news, and the impact that this has on the media and the public. And then 3, I've looked at the revenue question. Who gains from whom? How can value be more fairly, synergistically and sustainably generated and shared? And 4th, I mentioned ad tech. So the last point I want to talk about is dealing with artificial intelligence. So in this context, everybody will notice that we've seen in the past 10 years 2 trends in the information ecosystem globally. The one is the decline of news, and the other one is the rise of misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. Now, these are not coincidental, actually. The very same system that is squeezing news is also the system that ends up elevating this other content. And now, of course, we have that perfect storm of things happening there, which is destroying the information environment when what we need is to develop the information environment. That perfect storm is getting incredibly even worse because now you have generative AI. And this generative AI, we've all seen examples of it being used to create and target harmful content. We see it we also see in it the now familiar specter of a business that's built on news publishers' content, in this case, too often without their consent, their credit, or their compensation. Some of the usual suspects implicated earlier in this discussion are now also involved in this newly arising and interlinked business. So you have the business of distributing content, and now you've got the business of generating content. They both benefit from news, but in this country, neither is currently required to put something back in. Now, some of these AI services and some of their applications exist within their own market for content generation services and outside of the attention economy and outside of the advertising markets. But much of it is already intersecting. And here, when we look at these two businesses, content production and content distribution, we see that the most strategic space today is the distribution business, because you can produce as much disinformation as you want with generative AI, but you've got to get it out there, and that's where you've got to go through these gatekeepers. Of course, now you sometimes have the same companies causing problems there and causing problems here. But the thing is that the likes of Facebook, X, WhatsApp, TikTok, YouTube, Google Search, these occupy the key strategic space for discovery and circulation of content. And that's why I think the Competition Commission would be well merited to give special attention to this distribution nexus. Not to say that the AI nexus is irrelevant. In fact, the argument in our oral submission is, don't wait till you can sort out everything before you address this distribution problem. Because the whole question of intellectual property and generative AI and compensation there and quality control there and safeguards there, these are things still in very fast evolution. But you don't have to wait till all that gets more clearer. Anyway, the point I want to make finally is that news media are caught in a pincer grip now. Because if they exercise their right not to be scraped by artificial intelligence, under the current technology, they also cut themselves off from being listed in Google Search. So, you can't win in that way. It would be a loss for everybody if news publishers were to cut off from both the generative AI business and from the search business. The result would be low quality content would dominate, have a greater weight ranking in generative AI. It would be even more of a proportion of what exists in the distribution space. And the users of social media and search services receiving this would, of course, in their mix, they'd have even less news. So the alternative to parasitic relationships that are existentially threatening the hosts is to have an external intervention, one that can enable a real synergy across these markets rather than an exploitative one. So in conclusion, for the Competition Commission, examining the markets in production of content, generative AI, distribution of content, social media and search, and monetization of content, advertising, it's essential to keep sight of what the ultimate outcome is desired. To be noted, as I said earlier, the Competition Commission itself cannot deal with the entire gamut of challenges we face, but there's a lot that you can do to contribute to a much-needed solution. This is not a call to prop up inefficient old-style media, but it's a question of creating conditions for digital transformation where there can be real results and new entrants can actually come into the picture. So you have not just saving existing news, but expanding, opening up for newcomers. And a key mechanism that you can use to that is to get transparency, much greater transparency and data access in all three markets. And no redress will be possible unless there really is transparency for accountability. So the outcome is not just to secure existing media and existing levels of pluralism, but to facilitate the expansion of the field for new entrants to take part in the digital information and advertising economy and to be able to thrive and enrich the whole. Because the whole is what South Africa needs and deserves. It's the ecology to which we are all entitled. A healthy information ecology and a vibrant one. And at the moment, it's in danger. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guy. Chairperson, in addition to our comprehensive submission, we do make a summary of the points. And I think we just want to highlight 4 of those for this commission. And I think it will be important for this inquiry to consider the issue of provision of access to credible news as a public good, that it is a constitutional matter as opposed to it just being about commercial competition. And I think my colleague did cite a few And also in our submission, we may cite a few rulings which talk to that issue. And I think we've made a good case around the issue of fair compensation for news news in the public interest and stuff and news that is used on the platforms, and the call for a research in that regard. The issue of credible news is also one that is important for us, and I think most people will say, what is credible news as opposed to all news? We actually are referring here to news organizations that subscribe to self-regulatory bodies like the Press Council of South Africa, and also subscribe to the Press Code, which is our ethical code. And we believe that if the platforms actually prioritize this news, as opposed to all other news, and also it will work as a perfect antidote to disinformation. And I think Prof has spoken made a good point around the issue of transparency of the algorithms and the sharing of data between media companies and big tech platforms. With that, let me thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much for those submissions, and also the comprehensive written submission that we received. I mean, as you ended off there, it's right that these are certainly weighty issues. And I suppose our process is one of examining it, building evidence, and determining on the back of evidence findings, rather than a simple legislative process of just making a law. And we are bound by that. And I think part of this inquiry, although we've opened the door to discussion of remedies, also has to look at the finding part as well. I think if I speak for the panel, I think what we're starting to see is certainly a lot more nuance in this area, in terms of the different media players and also the roles of the different platforms. And I think there has been sometimes a tendency to lump everyone in together. And I'm glad your presentation and your submission sought to at least tease out some of the different media roles. And I think for us, some of the questioning today would just be to get a lot more of that nuance, because I think it lays a good foundation for the discussion that we're going to have throughout these hearings. So you have spoken a bit about community, vernacular, and even broadcasters. But I just wanted to start by just asking for a brief sort of set out, and I think this is partly also for the benefit of the public, because a public hearing has an educational aspect as well. But how you see the different roles of mainstream, vernacular, community, and even broadcasters, at least in providing the credible news, as you've put it, and the public good that the media may play.
Thank you, James. Paula, Sabu will lead us with Isak Minar following thereafter.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think the distinction we make, I mean, at a basic level, as we're saying, this is also educational. I mean, I think the concept of a public good is one that is well understood, but I think for purposes of record, it's to understand what that which is considered a public good is that which is easily available for everyone to use, but also does not, its usage by one person does not necessarily disadvantage the other. Now, the community media sector is particularly, and the SABC, are particularly important in the issue of the diversity of the media. I think that's what you're asking, Chairperson. Particularly around the issue of language provision. And we do find that when it comes to indigenous languages, those are not well promoted on the platforms, as an example I made earlier around the searches. And for us to reach that point where we have a diverse media that is representative of the people of this country, we believe that platforms should actually work with local media to promote those languages. And I think that is why it is particularly important for and that's why we make the point about the SABC. I mean, the SABC will be here to make their own submission, but I just think it's a point we make to highlight the importance of this sector in the provision of news generally. Isaac?
I think to look at what is the ultimate objective. And the ultimate objective is not to find a way for media companies to survive. To find a way for credible public interest content to serve the nation. But I actually want to put it the other way around. So what is the ultimate objective? The ultimate objective is for the public at large to have universal access to credible news that can help them to exercise their democratic rights in a democratic South Africa. And really what we're trying to do here is to say, how can one in an environment where new models of information dissemination developed, how can one make sure that you strengthen ways of getting credible content into the public domain and to as many people as possible? So within the media environment, you have different roles played by, for instance, national media to achieve that. And not very well, by the way, because most national media are English, and to a lesser extent Afrikaans, not in the languages that most of the people in South Africa speak. But you have community media, for instance, servicing that area, and particularly radio and the public broadcasters' radio services, which is by far the largest or the media with the biggest reach into all parts of South Africa. So while there's been a big focus often on we need to get publishers, we need to prop them up, we need to look at the whole range of different players and the roles and their audiences to see what is the best way to service the public with proper information. Another development in the media space over the past decade or two, forced often by downscaling of newsrooms, is the establishment of specialist units like Amabungane and Bekasisa and a whole host of investigative or specialist units. And there's already been quite a big change in the way that that information gets disseminated, in that they often act as a kind of a bureau, and that a number of different platforms use their content. So there's been changes in the model in the media itself, but what has not changed, or the problem that we're sitting now, is how dominant players like the tech platforms should be, the role that they should play in making sure that the content that still gets produced, that it gets to the broadest possible public, and of course then some kind of compensation for the content that they produce. If I have not answered part of your question, just say so, but I wanted Chris here on my side to just talk a little bit more about the role of community media.
Thank you, Isaac. Good morning, colleagues, Chair, James, and Paula. Thank you so much for this opportunity. My name is Christoph Amting. I'm here to represent the Association of Independent Publishers, and also to paint a picture of what community media looks like. I believe that once we've got that understood within this commission, we can then be in a position to understand it better and also to represent or help you represent us better as well. So I'll start off by just outlining what Association of Independent Publishers is all about. It's an institution that was established quite a while back. I should have done my research, but I'm a new member there, but I'm making some really good roadmap within the kind of members that they have, because I'm a new publisher as well. So Association of Independent Publishers is about over 190 publications, and these are independently owned community newspapers. Now, the picture of these kind of newspapers and publishers, you're looking at, some of them are one-man shows, being an editor, founder, salesperson, and distributor at the same time. Some of them have got maybe about 5 or 6 people, of which some have got volunteers and perhaps some interns working for those community newspapers. Now, the thing is, about all of these members that Association of Independent Publishers has in their stable and pretty much representing, is that they are in the community, they are responsible, and they create content from the community. So therefore, they are responsible and also are held to account for whatever they distribute within that community. So I think that's something that is really, really important here, is that they also are affected by the issues that they report on. Okay? So there is a face, there is someone that's in that community, and he might even be delivering that paper to you physically at your home, right? And you might bump into him at a local store. So I hope that kind of gives you a better understanding of the kind of publishers that Association of Independent Publishers represents. Now, I also need to just make it clear that Association of Independent Publishers is not claiming to represent all of the independent newspapers in South Africa. So it's a membership-based institution. So that's another point that we need to, because I do understand there's other players like the Caxton community newspapers or local newspapers who's also going to be doing their own submission. But I think there's a differentiator between them and us. But I think most of the things that we might unpack today here as well might be or are also experienced by them, but they're more established. So the other thing as well about Association AIP, I'll call them AIP for the sake of time, is that they represent indigenous languages as well. So there's a couple of publications there, and I would like to say perhaps 60% of them are indigenous languages and are grassroots, like a grassroots representation. When I say grassroots, I need to explain this concept, is that when you are a community newspaper, number one, in order to get advertising as an example, you need to have an ABC certificate, which is the Audited Bureau of Circulation certificate, to show that the copies that you print are what you are distributing. Now, if you don't have an ABC certificate, you either have a verification of free distribution certificate, which is also issued by the ABC as an institution. So grassroots are those that print irregularly. Some of them, they print maybe 2 editions a month or 1 edition a month. Some of them who have got ABC certificates print weekly, if not more than that. So that's just to frame the community media space. So now why I'm here really is to speak the language of these guys and to help you better understand and ask, more than welcome to ask more questions to better understand the community media, community independent media space. Thank you.
So, Chris, what percentage of your membership is online only versus members who print and are online?
Thank you so much for that question. I do not have the exact percentage, but I would like to say a very small percentage, because they just recently started to embrace online. And I also sit here as the project lead of one of the SANEF's one of the SANEF's projects, which is called the Community Media Digitization Drive, which does not look at only printed newspapers, but also community radio stations and community television. Now, the project itself by SANEF is to not just take the traditional community media products and give them a website, but it's also to deep dive into those businesses to say, how commercially viable are you going to be when you're in the digital space? Which is why I'm here to also represent that picture is looking very bleak. We are not being included in the kind of digital ecosystem of generating any form of revenue online. I hope that answers your question, Paula. If you'd like, I would do an audit to see and give you a proper percentage for the sake of this commission.
Thank you. And I think the Commission is actually hearing directly from quite a number of community media on their experiences online. So we'll take it forward then. I want to come back to SANEF, though, and to ask SANEF, what is your definition of news when we're talking about news as a starting point? And then could you just explain that when we're talking about news as content, what that package is that you might be looking at on a day or a weekly basis? Sabu?
Can I give the definition of news to my good professor and journalism teacher? But I think the last point I wanted to make to what Chris was saying to your question, Paula, that's also the point we make in our submission, in that there's no incentive for community media to transition to digital, because the reality is that they do not generate that much. There's research that says that in terms of their turnover, it's about 8 or 9% that they get from digital advertising, which then means that the traditional print run actually is still more lucrative, even though it's dying and outdated. So those are some of the challenges that we highlight.
Yeah, this is an important point, which it should also be, if I can be so bold as to suggest, be asked of the platforms. Because when Meta cut off news in Canada on their platforms, they ended up with a list of news websites where if there were links to them, they would not allow those on their websites. But in some cases, even discussion about these seemed to have been cut, like with the wildfires going on. So that was quite an expansive. News wasn't just the property of the news media, but it was basically news content. So I was going to say that I think there's a recent, interestingly, a recent study done by UNESCO and Ipsos, and they asked people, which sources do you think mainly have disinformation as opposed to news? Okay, and disinformation. And 70% of South Africans said it's mainly on social media. And then the question was, well, and where do you get your news? And 57% said we get our news on social media. So people are seeing more fake news on social media than they're seeing news. But it's still 57%. But the point I'm trying to make here is that when you ask a person what's news, what's the average person's understanding of news? And I think people can understand that news is also what it's not. It's not hate, it's not disinformation, it's not lies. It should be truthful, not say it's always neutral, but it should be truthful, verified. It's a result of some editorial process. And I think that one of the things that one could bundle into this is also informed comment. Because there's a lot of comment that's not informed, but the one thing that the news media does is give informed comment. So the comment is based on verified facts, and then it's not just any old facts, it's information in the public interest. So, this is part of the ethics of the media. If you're going to publish factual stuff, but it's a person's personal stuff, that doesn't qualify as legitimate news. But anyway, I think that this is a roundabout answer, but I think that it's just easy to take a kind of a common sense view about what do the public see as news. It's new information, and information as opposed to pure opinion. It's information as opposed to pure entertainment. It's information as opposed to lies and fraud and deceit. So what is news? It's what's there that people understand as a way to dependably orientate themselves to what's happening in the society, to make decisions about participating in the economy or voting or going to catch a taxi at a taxi rank where there may be violence, which is what happened to me this morning, etc., etc.
Thanks. And so I'm the economist and Paul is the media expert. So the questions from me may differ.
Could I just quickly add a follow-on for that, which Isak is here for the press council because Latifa is ill. But what's also important, and in the SANEF submission, is that the people who claim to be journalists, and they're propagandists or they recycle press releases and so on, but in terms of SANEF, it accepts that news that has a kind of a quality control mechanism, such as the Press Council, the BCCSA, this is a key defining aspect for making the pitch to the companies and to yourselves. And internationally, there's various other systems called the Journalism Trust Initiative and so on. But here, South African media says, if you're a member of one of these two, it means that you have a quality control, a public redress mechanism. And I think that is a key defining thing for what should count as news vis-a-vis the platforms in South Africa. Sorry to interrupt.
Not at all. Thanks for that clarity. I mean, I just want to come at it at a slightly different angle as well. So I think the public's experience of what a broadcaster or a newspaper or now a digital website is, that it's not just about political content. There's also entertainment. There's also, you know, food, sport, and I suppose for local community, you know, there's what's happening at the local school. There may be what's happening in terms of certain services, but also what's happening in the community, events and other things. So it seems your business model is not just about what we sometimes think, which is just narrow political content. And I imagine your commercial model also factors that in, and that's what I just want to understand, because if we are talking about the hardships of the media industry, you know, is it that your commercial model is selling a package that you might look to get a lot more adverts in the travel sports section to support your other stories, or do you narrowly look at whether a particular story is cost effective or not based on how many ads it may sell on your website or attract around it on an SABC broadcast?
I think, Chairperson, the important point to make is that when we talk about public interest journalism and credible news, we're not saying other forms of journalism, as just like sports or entertainment, are not important. And I think the reason why we specifically focus on this area of news is actually about the intrinsic value that public interest journalism has to the daily life and the functioning of a democratic society, and more importantly, the issue of public life. So I think for us, yes, the entire industry is in trouble. And it's not to say that because even if you pick up a newspaper, you have different sections. And most of the newsrooms in this country also do have various sections from your sports to lifestyle. But I think for the purposes of this commission, what we are saying, that's why I think to your question, Paula, about what is news, we make a distinction about what we regard as credible news. And as a guy had said, that anyone who subscribes to the Press Council and also to the South African Press Code at least can be held accountable for what they publish. We think that talks to the issue of credible news. And I think I did give what we regard as SANEF as a definition of public interest journalism. But I think in the main, I just wanted to make the point that we don't discriminate against other forms of journalism. We just think that in terms of the responses and also the sustainability interventions, that public interest journalism should be prioritized. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think for the panel, the question is more about, I suppose, the commercial aspects. And what's interesting in this inquiry is how platforms see the world and how the media see the world. And I think for me, it's just to tease out a little bit about, you know, you've spent a fair bit about what you think is wrong on the platform side, but I just want to understand how you're thinking as well. So I, just to take an example, Google might say, well, if I look at the value of news, I look at how many ads show on the same page. Is that your approach to your own publications? Or do you think about, I need to generate a package of revenue from all of my reporting that sustains all of that? And it may be that some sections do better than others in attracting advertising, but that doesn't mean I follow that and just produce more of that content. So how do you see the news business and your business? And how do you see the production of public interest where the social value may exceed the economic value? And it's just to how do you think differently to what you are saying the platforms think?
Yeah, so I think the platforms at one level don't discriminate between different content. But effectively, their systems are geared towards engagement. And so, because engagement, the longer they keep you engaged, the more ads they can show and the more data they get. It so happens that news is not especially engaging in the way that sensation, anger, emotion is. That's, the life. But it becomes a sort of a bit of a self-fulfilling thing in a way, because if you're not going to give people exposure to news on the social media, they don't know what they're missing. And so it's a question of, it's not that the audience market is fully set forever. There's a way to present in content feeds, here's some news, and maybe they use different metrics to rate different kinds of news. So if you're clearly a person who's from their data on you, because they have, for example, Facebook, when they show you one advert, use 28 million data points. Their systems, that's how they calculate whether to show you. So they'll say, okay, we from our data on you, we think that a financial advert would be, or financial news would be useful for you, and we'll show some financial advertising also.
Guy, I just want to, sorry to interrupt you, but I mean, I think the focus for us is how the media thinks.
Yes.
Because, you say you invest in public interest.
Yeah.
The commercial side of it may not warrant that. Why do you go and investigate? You're clearly thinking about it and coming at it from a different perspective.
There definitely is a different perspective. So, I mean, news producers are, of course, interested in engagement and reach and so on, but it's not the dominant driving value. So there is a lot of debate in the media industry that when stuff is online, you should not be simply responsive to what people are clicking on. You also have to bring some journalistic ethics and public interest. So there may be some sugar you have to sweeten the pill, but you also give them some nutritious, important content as well, because those are your ethics as a public service journalist. So I think media does work in a different way, and media do have a package of things. And of course, some news media, some soft forms of journalism attract more advertising than some hard forms. Sometimes advertisers don't want to be next to, depressing news. But other news, lifestyle news, sports news, all these other kinds of news do attract travel, leisure. And so, media does have more of a package approach, as opposed to basically, it's in my reading, it's purely virality on the and engagement on the social media.
James, if I may just add to that, I think there's an important distinction to be drawn between the commercial elements of journalism and the public interest criterions around journalism. I think a key example here would be investigative journalists who seek to fund their operations but not necessarily generate a profit. And the importance of investigative journalism cannot be gainsaid to uncovering everything from the Gupta leaks onwards. There's both a constitutional case for uncovering this information, as well as there is an economic one for investors and others to understand what is happening within our society. So in looking at that question, I think you have two models. You have a public interest, civil society-led model, and then you have a pure commercial model. And we're aware that some of the big publishers will be testifying in the coming days. They may be able to speak to the former. But SANEF's interest lies in the latter, and that is promoting journalism as a public good to fulfill a constitutional obligation.
I just want to ask a little bit, where are we going to see that while mainstream media has a really big search presence and gets a lot more referral traffic from search for community media and vernacular, we don't see search being that critical, but that social media is in fact, and as an example, you've got for Media 24 about 6% social media referrals, but for Isolezwe you've got about 32% social media referrals to stories. I wonder if you could just perhaps speak to that about in terms of how your members view both search and social media and the importance of both. And perhaps if you could just speak to that firstly, and then perhaps we can go deeper.
Sure, thank you so much, Paula. So I'll speak on behalf of the independent community media space. Like I said earlier on, not a large amount of those publications are now online. Okay, so that's number one. So, and with those that are online, it is difficult to even feature on Google News, as an example. And then there's an element of language as well, for search, like the example my colleague Sbu was mentioning. If you were to search a particular story in a vernacular language, the likelihood of that website featuring above the fold on SERP, or search engine result page, is very slim. So I don't know what's happening in the algorithms of Google. But as a matter of fact, if we knew what's happening, perhaps we could do something better. But yeah, when it comes to Google News, hardly any independent community newspaper features. And also when it comes to search, it's difficult to feature on search. Now, on Facebook or social media as an example, we wake up with it. We get to see what everyone else is doing in our community, whether it is from small little organizations, they're posting on Facebook. And I think that is why perhaps that the consumption of news is more higher on social. And that's where we also promote. We also promote our content on there. So we've got a frenemy with social media because we have to follow where the audience is. And currently it's on those social media platforms. And that is where most of the traffic that comes through to the website comes from Facebook. However, there's a lot more of people rather reading the news on Facebook and not even clicking through to the websites. So in Google's, call it, or call it big tech, or maybe Google and all the other search engines, they might be seeing us as a little grain of salt as opposed to a nice nugget of something. So that's why they're probably featuring it more than the bigger players. So that's just from a community media space. I hope that answers your question.
If I can add something here. It's a complex thing, and Google is changing. So if you look at Google in the past few years or so, when you search, first of all, you get AI-generated answers. You don't get links. And those answers are partially, but there's no traffic that comes from that. Then after the suggested answers, you get YouTube links. Well, hello, we know who owns YouTube. And eventually you might, but so this is an issue about of search. But search doesn't only exist, and people don't only search on Google. Those who've got teenagers will know that their teenagers search for homework stuff, they search on YouTube. They don't go to Google search engine. They search for video. The same on TikTok and so on. So search is actually much wider than the search engines. And then we also have to ask, what are the algorithms in search and what will they surface? Because if the dynamic in search or the dynamic in social media is engagement, are they going to yield up content that's not engaging, even though it may be informative? Because it's not search as a kind of a neutral, abstract, objective process. This is search in harness of a business model. And search goes hand in hand also with recommendations. So often people will get recommendations, even unsolicited recommendations, which directs them in a certain way, so that your agency to just come there and think, I'm just going to search on YouTube, I'm going to search on Google. It's not as if you come in as an autonomous person. You come in and there's a thing set up encouraging you in certain directions. So that's a whole other debate. But we shouldn't treat search as if somehow this was, just the kind of service it used to be back in the early days of Google, where they'd say, we give you the most credible content. And that was before even social media started setting up search facilities on social media.
Could you also perhaps speak a bit more about how you see the role of the different platforms in the news ecosystem, X, Instagram, Facebook, etc.?
Again, the platforms are changing. So X used to be a key generator of traffic to many media houses. And then they started, even before Elon Musk took over, they started demoting you if you had a hyperlink in your tweet, whether it was to whatever, a hyperlink to some other website, because they wanted to keep people in the ecosystem. And you find now the same with Facebook. If you click on a link, it keeps you within the ecosystem. But if you said there's a new article on Twitter and you put the link, you wouldn't get as much exposure to those who follow you as if you said there's a new article, you don't put the link. So that's how they've changed, to really use this correlating of audiences within their spaces. So I think that is, from a media point of view, kind of rather problematic, because they have the lock-in effects that, you have the network effects, then you have lock-in effects because people can't get out of the system and they can't lose their friends and their networks and their saved recommendations and so on. And then, in terms of the other platforms, I do think that WhatsApp is extremely important. People know, WhatsApp and WhatsApp groups is really, and WhatsApp now has channels which we touch on in this. But the thing is that now, WhatsApp has got so many millions of options. Unless WhatsApp were to say to people, there's an election coming up, here's some channels, IEC channel, SABC channel, people don't even know it's there. So it comes back to what do they promote and why do they promote it? Is it because with WhatsApp, although they don't have advertising WhatsApp, they still collect data. So they also still have this model to keep you on WhatsApp as long as possible. So because they get the data that goes into the big data business. And then TikTok, I think, is, this is a personal view, but I think it's more an indirect relation to news, because people are talking about news, and the actual news publishers is not, people who do news who are directly on TikTok is not as big as they are on other platforms. But I believe that when you come to YouTube, SABC's biggest online audience is through YouTube. So if they go on TikTok, but TikTok you have to have a particular format, short form video.
You would have heard James say in his opening remarks that X, although they've made a submission, have declined to actually participate and answer questions at the hearings. And I'm just wondering what your view was on whether X should in fact participate in hearings like this.
I think it's better for our chair to respond, but if I can give a personal response, I mean, any business making money in this country or in any country should do due diligence and meet the basic standards of a country. And if you look on X, they have advertising, so they're making some money, but there doesn't seem to be the commensurate commitment to cooperating with authorities.
I think it's quite unfortunate, actually, that they chose not to come here. I think the point here is that any business that operates in this country should actually respect local authorities. And I think it's quite unfortunate that they didn't come to this commission, because also part of the issues we're talking about in terms of news being deprioritized by platforms like Meta and X, talk to to the submissions that we've made here. It would have been great to have them here. Thanks, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on the earlier question by Paula, which, from what we can see, and just reading even, to be honest, the SANEF digitalization pilot, that there are decisions made about which, for instance, social media or search might be part of your strategy. And Chris, you said, that setting up a website and being on Google search was difficult. But from what we can see, so much of community newspapers have a Facebook page. That's what they've prioritized. And with the mainstream media, maybe they look at X and Facebook. So Facebook's large, it seems, for everyone. But X may not feature for community media. And so I suppose what we were just trying to tease out is, from the media perspective, how you see the platforms in terms of their role for mainstream community vernacular, how that may differ. Because, and to put a blunt question, well, if Google's not working and something else is working, are you still all right? And if you get Google working for you, might that also create other opportunities, but also issues? So just your view, not on how they operate, but just the role they play in their positioning.
Let me start on that. If you do an analysis of referral traffic for different kinds of media, you'll see very different patterns. And two big publishing houses with seemingly very similar type may have totally different referral patterns, and it has all to do with the editorial initiatives on to what extent they actually, for instance, actively or not post material to Facebook, as an example. So for some of the media houses who have for years built up an audience on Facebook, with Facebook now suddenly just decided that they're going to try and have less to do with news, it's a huge issue, because they lose a huge chunk of their audience. Similarly, I think for every media house, it's important to be that your content is prioritized on Google Search and Google News Search. I think if you look at Google referral traffic, there's probably more of a pattern that, some of the numbers that I've seen would be anything between 30 and 70% of traffic to news websites would come from Google search. I think it's quite different with Twitter. Also, it depends on how the particular newsroom wants to deal with Twitter.
Thank you so much for that question. Yes, Twitter for community newspapers is neither here nor there. It's a non-starter. I think it's only been working. And I'm talking now from experience, having worked at the Caxton Group as well during their early stages of digitization back in 2010. So how I view these social media platforms is that they are, you have to use them. And I'm speaking now from the heart, because I think for the community media publishers that I'm here to represent, we are we're at the right time. We are actually in a good space right now. And having been invited to the Competition Commission on this topic, for us it's a good place to be, because then we are seen as serious. We are serious, and we are representing the people that rely on us in the communities for news. Otherwise, if we don't exist, we are not going to, we're going to be letting people mislead each other, sharing things on Facebook. So we are there pretty much to say, look, let's have these kind of conversations. I really see these social media platforms as agencies. And if we have to talk about money, I would see that they should be getting agency commission and giving the rest of the money that they generate from news to the people that produce the news. So if we can kind of look at it from that perspective, I know I'm coming up with some kind of what I would love to see. I'll be tested, but the thing is, I honestly see them as agencies, and they should be getting some 20%, 16% of whatever revenue that they generate from news, because the majority of that money is supposed to actually go towards the people that produce the content. So I know I digress, but I think I'm speaking from the heart to say that, look, we have to use them to generate traffic. Yes, we do have Facebook pages. Those pages are actually our marketing strategy, and we should give them the opportunity to get a bit of money as well. But the majority should be going to where the production of the content is being done.
Another point, another point on the issue of social media is that newsrooms actually do use them for different purposes. Like you produce different content pieces that are suitable for a particular market. For instance, with TikTok, whatever content we put out on TikTok, that would be short, sharp, and punchy, because that we understand to be how TikTok operates. But then would still have a comprehensive, for instance, on issues like election manifestos, you would have a more comprehensive, longer explainer of what a particular party's manifesto, as opposed to doing a simple piece, which is elections in 60 seconds, or manifesto in 60 seconds, which might be suitable for TikTok. So newsrooms do kind of use these different platforms for those purposes. But I think the point here is also the fact that when the algorithms changes, we don't know. You just see a dip. Sometimes what we face in terms of web online traffic as news publishers is that sometimes there's a fluctuation or a sudden dip in traffic, and you don't know where that comes from. Because there is no transparency from the platforms to say this is what we've done and this is how this will impact you. And I think that also talks to part of the reason we're here today. Thanks.
Can we ask Professor Glenda Daniels to speak, please?
My point relates to an issue that's just been alluded to but not clearly spelt out. For example, X has been found to be the worst culprit with the bullying of women journalists. The cyber misogyny of women has just actually gone rife over the last 10 years, and it's gotten worse, literally every year. And there's no accountability at all. Nobody knows where to go, how to go. You try and phone Twitter about a complaint, and they leave it there because they want that traction, they want the attention, and so forth. So the fact that women are being threatened with rape, murder, they are being doxxed and trolled, etc., nobody seems to know what to do about this. And I'm afraid to say that at one time, I don't know if we mentioned statistics here, there were about 10,000 journalists in the newsroom. They're now less than 500, which is all related to the sustainability of journalism. And within that matrix, women journalists' voices are being lost even more than others, because they are the ones who are suffering this scourge, actually. Just yesterday there was one with Karen Morn with a picture of a gun to her head. It's all over Twitter. What does Twitter do? X. What is X doing about it? Nothing, because they are enjoying the attention. So that's the one thing. This all relates to participation, plurality, diversity of voice, and half of the population, if not more than half of the population, are actually women. I think, in a nutshell, I think that really, really must be put on the agenda when we are making this submission. It's the particularity about gender equality that I'm talking about. Thanks so much.
Thank you for that that intervention. I think it is important that is also not lost, and I think it's made in your submission and also in the submission of others, that also journalists may be targeted through social media, and that may also impact then negatively on trying to do public interest journalism. Just to pick up on the evolving space, just two examples and just get your comment on that. Guy, you mentioned TikTok. TikTok's relatively young as a platform. We see it rapidly rising in the Reuters Institute rankings of where people go for news. And of course, what people see as news may not be what they see as news. But I was interested also recently, the head for government relations in Kenya had indicated that also the type of content people are going there is changing. As there may be only so many videos of lip syncing and dancing you can stomach, and people then look for business. And it was an interesting list of topics. It's also the news from the submissions we've got seem to have only started to understand what they can do on TikTok and how they can reach the audience, and so even they are at an early stage, it would seem. The other is Google. What was interesting to me is a lot of search, as we call it, is coming from Google Discover, which for anyone with an Android phone will knows where you go to get entertainment, news, sports, but that seems to be far bigger than Google News, and sometimes even Google Search. Now it's lumped together, but that is a personalized service. It's not a search service. But it's using the content they have access to package what may have been in the Facebook news feed at some point, but now is not. So I think it is evolving. Maybe just get your comments on some of those examples before we carry on with other questions.
I don't have a kind of comprehensive response to offer, but what's interesting is that Facebook started off saying, we are here to connect your friends and family, and then they got into meaningful engagement, and then they started imitating TikTok. So they shifted towards that TikTok model, and TikTok is really, it's no different to Netflix in a sense, that although it's user-generated content, but it's not your social network that is determining what comes on TikTok. It's personalized on the basis of you and the basis of what is getting virality broadly. And so it's almost going from a social media model towards a Hollywood model that you just now are outputting, but it's very personalized in the way that Netflix is personalized. And clearly it's a good business, but the question then is, you can do that if you TikTok, because you're buying data on the data market about people, you are collecting a huge amount of data, and so then you have little news media on the side, which is not in the data-driven business. in the same way and could never be getting the same scale of data and data analysis and data analytics and so on. So it then falls, I think, to TikTok to say within the way that they configure what they're going to show you, because it's all recommended content, sometimes response to questions, but or to people you're going to follow, but that could they make a business whereby every 10th video they put in something that's kind of content coming from a member of the press council or a member of the, because press council people are doing video, or a member of the BCCSA. So that is a question for them. As far as the Google goes, again, Google, it's a very good point you make, that Discover is, again, a data-driven, almost broadcast model. So it's not kind of pure search, and it's very much based on these individual data profiling and the whole use of third-party cookies, which they have been using. So for the purposes of those who don't know, third-party cookies is when any website you go, it's collecting data on you, and often it's selling that data or sharing that data back to these big platforms. So that's why they have such huge data, and they can do that. It's not a bad thing from an individual point of view, but it's also a question then of, can we have a fragmented society where people only have individual, very personalized services, or do we need a common public space, which is what news media tries to do. It tries to have more of a collective interest and serve the same content to a range of people. It may be a niche, but it's not more than one. I mean, yeah, it is more than one.
I think this question also speaks to the vulnerability of news media in dealing with the platforms, in that you never know what's next. An important content contributor of a type of content which I argue that there should be an obligation on tech platforms to carry, but there is no effort to share information and data, stats, information. If newsroom, I have no idea how my content is doing on another platform. No information is shared with me to give me an idea of what I can do better or different so that my content perform better, or what I can do to tap into some of the algorithms to make sure my content get to the right place. A few years back, when I was still editor of SABC Digital News, we had this instance, short video started here on what was then still Twitter. We got a visit from Facebook to say, oh, by the way, the kind of video material that you post to Facebook, we just want to say to you, we have started to deprioritize it because we need to compare with short videos on Twitter, and you better start making short videos and post that to Facebook, because then your stuff will be better. So will perform better. So I mean, that is after the fact. No consultation, no prior notice that there's going to be a change. As a result, what many newsrooms are doing, and that's why you also see, is to format, put it on X, on Facebook, on Google, and everywhere, to try and just get to some kind of audience. And I'm not sure that that is also productive, and I think it's also very kind of prescriptive to content providers, to force them into formats and expenses to start doing that. A final point on this. The fact that those content then becomes available across platforms, same material, speaks to another issue, in that you can never get a full picture of how that piece of content is doing, because each platform have different ways to measure impact as an example. And never ever will they speak to each other, or will they put something in place so that you can have a better idea of how your content is doing across platforms. Thanks.
Sorry, I think we're out of time because of our schedule, and we never have enough time with each individual stakeholder. But in the interests of getting through the timetable, we do need to keep it shorter. I mean, there's a huge amount that we would like to engage further with SANEF and partners, but I also think there's a lot will come out through other stakeholders as we dig deeper and progress through this hearing. Just maybe for your benefit on the international, I'm not looking for a response now, but to give you some context, you know, part of our scope is to look at how also platform algorithms may affect competition between different media. It was mentioned, Spood, that by yourself that there's an oligopoly, that mainstream has not transformed. So that is something that we also look at. It's not just the competition that may happen with the platform itself. And maybe if community media is not on Google, that might be a problem. But if they're also producing very different news, that may shape how we think about it as well. On the foreign media, I suppose it's a question if foreign media is reporting on things that you're not reporting on, well then of course that's maybe more an agency relationship. Chris mentioned that. But it's also the case that foreign media is reporting on some South African events. And then the question of, again, how does their reporting feature relative to domestic media's reporting, and that may also go to the diversity of voice and South African voice on some of these issues. But also South African media do report on key international events and have a different perspective and voice to maybe some of the other international media. So on those international events, you know, such as the Gaza war, where does South African media again stack when you search or go look at a top news tab or flick onto your Google Discover? So I think those are the questions that we had. And as we tried to set out, I think maybe unsuccessfully, was also, as was noted, certain deals are being done globally. Are those starting to influence how the algorithms behave? And you know, I think we're just aware, and Reuters makes the point in their research, that there can be a risk of a winner takes all as well in this sort of context, in the media side of who can monetize, who can put up paywalls, who can generate the revenue. But I think importantly, you know, you rightly pointed out that we're not alone in thinking about these things. But critical for the panel and the technical team is we must have a South African perspective. It happens in a context, and I think you've rightly sketched that out. We can't just be saying, oh, because Australia did it, or now Indonesia, that's what we do. We need to understand it deeply in a South African context, because we do have, you know, a lot of unique challenges, and a lot of countries that have looked at this have been developed economies, not developing. And so it's important that we, through the proceedings of this public hearing, bring out that detailed South African dynamic and the particular aspects of that affects, because obviously news, you know, as you pointed out, as a public good is important for democracy. It's critically important for this country, so we have to get it right for our circumstances as well. So thank you for the presentation and coming in. I think we have definitely benefited from all of this. And we look forward to the future engagements. I think from out of these public hearings, we will potentially send out more requests for information that may be very specifically targeted around the presentations you've made and some of the issues you've raised. I mean, it's unfortunate we couldn't get into things like misinformation, AI, constitutional rights, but we do have many questions, and we'll send that through. And there's also within within this an opportunity to also have in camera if there is specific sensitive information that you wish to share. But the submissions also allow for that confidentiality regime. So thank you for being the first and for kicking us off.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Co-Chair. I think, as you say, if there are any further submissions, we will be able to make those to the Commission as it so pleases. And thank you to you for your reception, and thank you to the fellow members for joining us. Thank you, Chair.
And so our next stakeholder, while we have the shift in seats, is the. All right, we're going to take a 5-minute break while we have a switch over, and then we'll be joined by Khadija Patel from the International Fund for Public Interest. Welcome back from the break, and we're proceeding now in the public hearings with Khadija Patel from the International Fund for Public Interest Media. Welcome, Khadija. And I know you don't have a PowerPoint presentation, something I admire, but if you could give us some of your opening remarks, and then the panel has questions for you.
Thanks very much, Chairperson. As part of my abiding protest against big technology, I refuse PowerPoint. But thank you for inviting me. And I'm actually a great fan of technology, and I don't think I would have been a journalist in South Africa without technology. I didn't train as a journalist in university. I actually trained in social linguistics and languages and literature, and got into journalism quite by accident. I was a blogger back when there was a great, hand-wringing over whether blogging would spell the end of journalism. Through blogging, as a master's student, I discovered that I could get paid to write. Started off with writing about cricket, and then worked in community media, and ended up the editor of the Mail and Guardian for some reason. So I am an ardent believer still of the democratizing potential of digital technology, especially when it comes to the free flow of information. And I think that must be made very clear. I think that technology continues to be an essential tenet in ensuring the free flow of information, and that really is why many of us around the world are concerned about the crisis we're currently in, because we are in a crisis. Professor Daniels, in the last session, mentioned the number of journalists in active employment in South Africa today, and it's startling that that contraction is absolutely startling, and that contraction has happened very, very rapidly. And what we want to make clear as well is that this is not us feeling hard done by because a couple of our friends don't have jobs anymore, but rather the point here is that the fewer journalists we have in active employment, the less we know about the complexity of South Africa. Any place, any space is deeply complex. It's filled with different stories. And the role of journalists in a free media has always been to flesh out that complexity, to help us understand what is happening. And our understanding is slowly being eroded. And I would say is almost our understanding of each other is almost at dangerous levels right now when we think about the levels of xenophobic threats that we see being made publicly. So yes, we are in a crisis, and the crisis is that there is no business model for independent public interest media. There isn't one. Unless you're backed by a billionaire, or you're the New York Times or the Guardian, you're not likely to be making much money out of news. And that has particular consequences then for how much work we can do. We can lay the blame for this current crisis at, someone will say, yes, but it's the journalists' fault. They never saw this coming. Or to have done more to have stopped this. Others, will say, no, it's all about technology. They fooled us into this position. But I don't think it's productive for us to go on, on a hunt for who is the culprit. But rather, I think we can together arrive at a conclusion that there is a crisis. And that crisis imperils safety, security, and humanity in South Africa. So what I'm doing now is my work is with the International Fund for Public Interest Media, which is an international organization launched officially just last year in New York at the official World Press Freedom Day celebrations. And the International Fund has come out of the realization of this crisis, which is of course not unique to South Africa. And the realization that we need a system of responding similar to what we've seen in global health. So just as we have the Global Fund that responds to particular global health challenges, we need an international fund built along similar lines to respond to the threat facing, and it's an existential threat, to independent public interest media around the world. So it is a fund, it's a financing mechanism. We ensure both the short and medium term financial survival of individual media organizations, while at the same time working with ideas, organizations to try to find the systemic change that needs to happen to ensure that we have a healthy media ecosystem. So the International Fund is headquartered in Paris, but has regional representation around the world. In Africa, we're led by Regional Director Mahmoud Kamara. We similarly have directors for Latin America as well as Asia and the Pacific. We work only in low and middle income countries because some of our funding is derived from ODA, development assistance, and as a result of that, we cannot work in high income countries. But this is somewhat of a blessing and not really an obstacle, because the need is certainly greater in low and middle income countries. Much of the challenge that we are articulating here, that we're trying to delve into here, exists as well in the US, especially in what they call flyover country. But when you hear the astonishing amounts going into local media in the US right now, we don't have access to that kind of philanthropy in South Africa. And that is why countries like South Africa, media markets like South Africa, are especially fragile right now. I'm going to say again, we have a crisis, and this crisis is especially acute right now because we spoke, my colleague spoke in the last session, and you had some questions about referrals from social media. Globally, referrals from social media are down between 50% and 80% over the last year. And this is being felt by everybody from the largest news organizations like The Guardian right up to Rappler, an independent news organization in the Philippines. And of course, there's no communication of this. Like most changes in the algorithm, us sitting here in the bottom part of Africa just kind of figure out that something's changed, something's not working anymore. We've got to figure out, is it something that we've got to tinker with in our code, or has this or other platform just made new decisions? And I can tell you that as an editor, this is one of the frustrating things of trying to ensure that you have a digital audience, because we do not have access to the connections within these organizations that can tell us this or that is happening. And I don't say this lightly. If you read, for example, Ben Smith's book, Traffic, and Ben Smith was the editor of BuzzFeed News, which was shut down, I think last year sometime. And many of us, even in South Africa, ended up replicating the tone and style of BuzzFeed because that's what we saw was being done. That's what was getting shared right? So we end up creating content that we see mostly American counterparts doing, because that's how we understand, that's how we interpret the algorithms. So we end up with news products that are hollowed out, frankly, through the years, because the Faustian bargain we made with technology platforms was they would deliver scale to us. We gave them our links, our content, and they delivered scale. And for several years, those of us who knew how to do it well received audiences at scale that we could not have received through our traditional platforms at all. And that has now slowly been cut back. We know that Facebook wants to exit news entirely. That has profound consequences for a place like South Africa, where where Facebook rather is the largest social media platform, and people understand the internet as social media platforms. So what then do we do, and how, my concern is when we think about particularly the social media referrals and juxtapose that to a very poorly performing advertising economy in South Africa right now. You speak to most publishers and they'll tell you that there's just no business out there. That's the direct business, going through ad agencies. There's just nothing left there anymore. And the CPMs we get, the rates that we receive in South Africa when we implement technology from Google, or when we put up our content on YouTube, we get that, the rates that we get are far inferior to what our colleagues in the US or Europe are getting. So we could build up channels that are 1 million plus strong, which is a big audience in South Africa, but you're not going to be making enough out of that advertising that you're getting there to be able to sustain that. So then we're told, what you need to prioritize is reader revenue. It's paywalls, it's memberships. That's what you have to do. Stop banging the advertising drum. It's gone. Just focus on reader revenue. And we know that in South Africa, we perhaps have one of the best examples of a successful reader revenue project in the Daily Maverick. It's not a subscription model; it's a membership model. But there's a limited number of people who have disposable income for such things, right? So that's why we're not seeing these kinds of models being universally applied, because if it was easy to apply, everybody would have done that by now. But I've just come back from Europe. I've spoken to some of my colleagues in the Nordic countries, and the Nordic countries have for a long time been the envy of many of us, because they've had immensely successful reader revenue projects. Immensely successful, because if you think about Norway, it's a high-income country, highly literate, and you've got the monopoly on the Norwegian language. So yeah, people are going to subscribe to you, and yet my colleagues I just spoke to an editor whose entire paper was shut down outside of Oslo in the last few weeks. And in Finland, there's a similar consolidation, more layoffs happening. And this is a consequence of their economies performing poorly over the last 18 months. So in sluggish or slow economies, even in high-income countries, reader revenue projects are now not working. So that is not an option for us in South Africa at all. What we're mourning is not the death of newspapers. What instead we are really afraid of is a future without access to news at a low price point. And when I say news, I mean high quality, independent news. That's what newspapers ultimately represented. And that is what's missing right now. Digital technology ought to be facilitating that at scale in ways that we've never seen before. And yet, the reverse is happening. The truth is that digital technology platforms are incentivized by creating profit for their shareholders. They're not incentivized by the democratic objectives of South Africans. So we need to ensure that their objectives and ours are able to be achieved together. Already, we're seeing a lot of angst over the implementation of generative AI. And in many cases, as far as we can tell, some of the large platform companies, are happy to just, let the current crisis run its course because they need to focus on the next big thing, which is generative AI. Guy, in his comments earlier, mentioned, when you do a Google search in South Africa these days, you basically get these questions and answers. It's already being implemented here. And what's shifted already is the value exchange between news publishers and technology. Because previously, I'm an editor and we publish a story about this commission. It gets put up on our website. That link is indexed by Google. It's on one or other of its gateways over there. Similarly, I'm not even going to go into Facebook. Let's just focus on Google. Now, the way search is evolving is I would click what happened at the Competition Commission today, and I would not need to go into News 24 to actually read that article. Instead, how the future might evolve is there would be, an answer there for me. Because what generative AI does is that it reads all of our work and feeds back that answers to you on its own platform. So that value exchange is now already shifting. So that Faustian bargain we made for scale is already falling apart. And it's falling apart in the graveyard of news as we have it already. I'm pretty sure I can talk a lot more, but I'll allow you to ask me some questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Khadija. That was, I think important to hear, especially on the first day, and set the scene for the hearing. And I think you make a good point about paywalls and membership and how that is evolving. And certainly from the submissions we've got to date, I think the challenge in a country like South Africa, as you say, is there's a very small amount of people who can pay. But also even the ability to fund the public broadcaster probably is not the same as the BBC. And so advertising is going to play a much bigger role if we're going to hit that price point, certainly. But maybe Paula, just to start with you.
I wonder, Khadija, if you could just speak very, very briefly on your experiences as the editor of a community paper, the Daily Vox, versus a mainstream media paper, the Mail and Guardian, and just navigating the platforms as such.
you'd be surprised, but with the Daily Vox, we actually had better access to Google. And that's because my co-founder was employed by Al Jazeera at that time. And Al Jazeera had their own avenues into the upper reaches of Google. So, when we sometimes had issues with indexing, particularly on, on search, we would, it would be, one email away. I remember for a long time we really struggled because Google continued to mark us as a blog, and we really wanted to be taken seriously as a news source. And so, it took, direct access to Google. I mean, obviously we tried to write to who exactly do you write to? At that time, Google didn't have an office in South Africa. So, yeah, you'd be surprised. Whereas I didn't have those connections myself when I was at the Mail and Guardian, and very much relied on on organizations like SANEF and the lobbying that we're doing together to try to understand who is doing what, where, and how we're able to approach different parts of the technology platforms. At some point, I would say that Facebook, as it was then, was much more accessible to us than Google at some point. Obviously, they come to us with gifts, carrying gifts, which are mostly their products. Saying, hey, we want to do more video. As I said, they'll come and say, we're going to do more video. We'll give you a bit of money, to start up a video team. And it was funny because I actually met, the former Facebook representative, in an informal setting a few months ago, and we were with somebody who actually produces entertainment content. And she laughed at me and said, you see, if you had listened to me back then, you would be him, because he has now got, I think like daily traffic of a few 100 million or something. He basically just takes existing entertainment shows and clips them in. Anyway, so he's earning, good money out of that. So I said to her, your idea was great, and I don't deny that, we needed a video team then, but who was going to pay for it when you left? And that really is, I think, some of the frustration with, for us as, as journalists here in South Africa, is that most often we're able to reach the tech companies when, when they're trying to tell us about, some or other product. I mean, sometimes they're really useful products. I mean, I've received various kinds of Google trainings throughout my career that have, they've been instrumental in how I put together stories, or how I look at data. Respecting as well that it's not all been propaganda. Many of it has been really, really useful, but that is really most of our engagements with with tech companies. It is very difficult because we are classified as rest of the world. The tech companies have this designation, US. When they put together their their company algorithm, organogram, it's the US, and then everybody else is called rest of the world. We fall in the rest of the world. It doesn't matter, whether we're 100 million strong or 1 billion strong. We're still rest of the world, right? So this points to a greater challenge with the way that tech companies structure themselves, and how they, how they have presence in the countries that they work in, what type of investment they make, in those countries, even for things like, like safety, like Professor Daniels mentioned earlier. I think that at one stage, it was the Facebook whistleblower, I think, who gave the number of safety officers that were working across East Africa at one point, and this is a very diverse linguistic region, and I think there was something like 4 safety officers, covering a plethora of languages, so they did not see, a genocide being planned online, so to speak. So this really, there is a structural problem that has been well documented in the way the tech platforms operate, and I know that Google do have offices in South Africa now, but they're not they're not really geared for this time. I know that the Google News office is quite new; it's about 18 months old, so hopefully that bodes well for the future. But until then, it's basically a guessing game most of the time.
How do you define public interest media?
There are so many definitions, and the International Fund we have our own definition on our website, which I'll be happy to share with you. But for me, public interest media is any media that allows people to understand their world better. Media that is free from undue influence, first of all, and that allows people to understand their world better. I think that, for a short definition, that is it.
If the social value of public interest media exceeds the commercial value, then how was this resolved in the past in order to ensure that we were able to have public interest media? I mean, how did we pay for public interest media previously?
Historically, I think the problem is that I think that this is unprecedented in the scale that we're seeing it. I think we have to think about things like, previously in some jurisdictions there was some form of public subsidy, that existed for media. Certainly in some high-income countries continues to exist, but the truth is that advertising for the longest time did sustain news media. Philanthropy, of course, has played some part. It's notable that some of the best journalism in South Africa over the last 10 years has been donor-funded journalism. So, philanthropy can't be the solution. I think that better flows of philanthropy certainly will be essential to ensuring the survival of media. But ultimately, I think that we have to find a public solution to this.
When you think about how many people actually make money out of content that they haven't necessarily produced, and then you look at the cost of what it costs to actually produce news, I wonder if you could give us a sense, for example, of what it would cost to do an investigation, a large-scale investigation that would need follow-up and follow-through.
Investigative journalism is the most expensive form of, you're mostly looking at, your first expense there is time, in order to do an investigation well. So to have a highly experienced investigative journalist put 6 months, of their time solely on one project, you're looking at least 300,000 rand, maybe, right? I'm being conservative here. That's without the cost of any transport they might need to different places in South Africa, any access to to data services, any other people that you have to bring in to help. If it's a data project, if it's a big swarm of data, you actually need data scientists. That's without counting the cost of data scientists if you don't have one on your team. Depending on what type of investigation it is, for 6 months, you need to look at something between 300 and 500,000 rand if an investigative journalist is focusing on one story. But that is increasingly becoming a rarity in South Africa. I'll be surprised if there are any investigative journalists focused on one story for that length of time these days.
I think you usefully said sort of earlier that the shrinking of journalists had meant that we know less about the complexity of South Africa. But just on a practical side, fewer journalists, does that mean that newsrooms are saying, I can't afford to pursue this story? Or the depth of stories is maybe lost because a journalist is doing multiple investigations at the same time. So just practically in your tenure, again, as editor, but also what you see.
Both, actually. I think close to the end of my tenure at the M&G, I remember being in a room with several editors, and we were having dinner together. And what was remarkable for me is that I think there was a water crisis somewhere in the country at that time. I can't remember, but it was outside of the major metros. So it's a substantial investment to send someone to that place. None of us had people there. And this was a crisis that had been unfolding over a number of weeks. And each one of us spoke about allocating resources for the coming year. This was, tellingly, this was January 2020. We ought to have known there's a firestorm coming. And I remember one editor from a very successful newsroom said, a Joburg-based newsroom, saying, we were in January, I'm not sure if I'm even sending someone to cover the State of the Nation address. We'll cover it from television. So that can give you an idea of how difficult it is actually to send a journalist, like, to you as an editor. You've got to make, you've got a budget. You've got to think about how you're going to be allocating that budget. You've got to think about, first of all, the safety of that journalist, rights. You've got to think about accommodation. You've got to think about travel. You've got to, and it's often not just one journalist. You perhaps have a photojournalist or a video journalist, who's going as well. So it's not just one person. There are various costs associated, and it becomes extremely difficult then to do this kind of work. I will speak candidly, and I've spoken candidly about the fact that at the Mail and Guardian, one of our greatest issues was that our cars kept breaking down. We simply could not afford the upkeep of the newsroom's vehicles. And that had a consequence on how we were able to allocate stories, especially if they were outside of Johannesburg. So we then have the skewed view also of what is happening in the country as a consequence of this. There are many newsrooms, I think the Mail and Guardian's situation is quite profound and very pronounced, compared to others. But I think that nearly every newsroom in South Africa is similarly making, these types of calls based exactly on the cost and resources that we simply do not have to ensure that these stories are done well.
Khadija, in an interview you did, you spoke about the economic divide in the access to quality journalism, that the good stories were behind a paywall, and that the general public that was receiving information outside the paywall were basically getting, I think you said, rubbish. But then you also spoke about it's not just a divide in readers, it's also a divide in the providers of news, because the news business is unsustainable. And only very rich or powerful people have the means to own, produce, or transmit news nowadays. Could you speak to that for a few minutes, please? Thanks.
Thanks very much, Paula. I increasingly think that journalism will become the remit of an elite, because already we're seeing young women especially told, that's not a job you want to pursue, right? It irritates me to no end. because I want every woman who wants to be a journalist to be able to go and do that. But it's my colleagues who are pointing out the very real pitfalls that a young journalist may face. And we're seeing this around the world, not just in South Africa, but even when, visiting WITS a few months ago, speaking to a former WITS student there, and she laughed and said, "I wonder how many of my of my fellow students are actually still journalists," because increasingly what happens is that you end up in either public relations or many other journalism adjacent jobs, simply because you almost need a supplemental income to be a journalist, or some other clever way of making it work. And of course, this is a generalization. Of course, there are very capable journalists in South Africa who are earning good salaries. Certainly, I don't think anyone is denying that. But I think that what I'm pointing to is that there's a barrier for ensuring and maintaining a career in journalism right now. And that will have consequences, I feel, for the racial diversity of newsrooms in South Africa. It will have consequences also for the access to the types of stories we do. And again, our idea of what is happening outside, if it's, if our window is only being framed by a certain type of people.
Is there a relationship between declining media sustainability and declining media trust?
I think to many extent, I think it certainly happened parallel. I do believe, however, that what we can't discount is an organized campaign against media as well, that is being driven by presidential candidates in the US to presidential candidates in South Africa. So there is a level of organized campaign that I think that further erodes this trust that's happening alongside it. But the fact that newsrooms are not on, in their best shape has also meant that you can point to, oh, remember those guys made that mistake? Yeah, you can't trust anything that they say, right? So, it has made us more vulnerable to the perception of being untrustworthy. So yeah, I wouldn't say I would say it's in parallel rather than a direct consequence, but certainly a parallel with perhaps some meeting points at some point.
Khadija, you just spoke to almost how this may shape who goes into journalism and what stories and whether we get any diverse views. And you define public interest journalism as free from influence as well. So I just wanted to get your perspective. I mean, philanthropy can be pure philanthropy, but I suppose if you're pursuing philanthropy, you want to make sure you're doing things that philanthropists find interesting. And if you've moved to paywall strategy, you also want to know what is interesting to those who have the money. So, I mean, do you see these factors as free from influence, for one? I mean, and two, is it a sustainable path to public interest media?
Are we talking about philanthropy or the paywalls?
Both. I mean,
Yeah.
and it goes to Paula's previous question as well about that.
Yeah. I don't think either of them, are the gateways to sustainability. I think that they both might be one among a mix of strategies that have to be employed to obtain resilience. I hate the word sustainability because media right now is inherently an unsustainable enterprise. but rather to obtain resilience. But certainly, I think that as a media manager, what you have to weigh up, right, at any time, is when you're getting some kind of philanthropic support, right? What are the, do they have any kind of editorial guidelines that come with that? So it's not that popular in South Africa, but for example, elsewhere in Africa, there are many grants that come, this is it's mostly small grants, like a $20,000 grant to investigate corruption in the Niger Delta, right? And there's many such grants that are quite popular in much of Africa. In South Africa, we don't have access to, to that kind of philanthropy, thankfully, but the kind of philanthropy that that has honestly sustained some organizations has come with its own baggage, right? So, though many funders, and they're, and now I'm talking about private philanthropy. I'm talking about the likes of Luminate, the Open Society Foundation. These are organizations that are well known for their funding to media. Many of them sign contracts that that set out that they will never ever have any control over the editorial output of the organization. What it does, what we have to weigh up then, however, is the association we have with these organizations, and whether that is something that we want to put, basically put our brand against. So even now, there's, I think, something in a South African paper last week, basically alluded to me, for example, being a South African agent. I mean, an American agent, still missing a salary from the CIA. But the point that I'm bringing up is that it's not free from the perception of influence. Though it might be free of influence, there is the perception of influence. And this is why when taking philanthropic funding, you have to be clear about communicating what this is for and how it's used. So yeah, and it has its own philanthropy, particularly has the pitfalls of being subject to the whims of one or a group of people, right? So billionaire X can decide today that he's not interested in the media anymore, and actually wants to explore space travel and would rather put that money into space travel, and then that puts if you were depending on a grant from that philanthropy, that puts you in a particular challenge, which has also been experienced, right? It's a very real problem for many organizations around the world right now. So I think there are important parts of the ecosystem and part of the revenue mix, if we want to talk about it, that might be available. But when it comes to reader revenue and being guided by audience behavior, this is the tricky part, right? Because, for example, I often tell people that I became, I think I became a journalist because my father used to have Sky News on, and the only reason he was watching Sky News was he used to wait for 20 past the hour because he's a Liverpool fan, and he only was waiting for the sports news. But I was basically in front of the TV watching the rest of it and endlessly fascinated by the news. I mean, this is pre-internet, right? So there has to be that mix of stuff, and that the audience behavior is going to go this way. But at the same time, I think that a responsible editor has to balance out reader behavior with your public interest mandate as well. And I think that we're increasingly media management talking about is, a product-centric approach to think about, a news product, and a news product is diverse, that it has the stories about corruption, but it also has, a crossword. And so to ensure that, products are well-rounded and accessible to people with, very different tastes, with very different information needs as well. And I think that's that's important. So yes, there's a definite danger to, to be exercising your that kind of like a filter bubble, and using your readers as the filter bubble, and just confirming their bias with what you're doing, because that rewards you with the scale that you need to build revenue. So this is why there has to be some kind of interrogation as well of our values, of our news values, especially when we are talking about a value exchange with tech companies. What are our news values, and and how is that driven? So it's difficult. I think that I would like to think that all, especially in South Africa, from what I see, I think editors try their best, to not act completely responsively to their audience behavior, but try to ensure that they are meeting their audience needs while at the same time exercising the public interest imperatives of their work. But it can, you can, for example, run into interference, at some point. When things are good, you can do that. When things are tougher, it becomes more difficult to do that. As an editor in a newsroom, within an organization that wasn't doing so well, that meant that, yes, that sometimes, I was told, can't you just tone it down a bit on the corruption stuff? Do a bit more lifestyle. We think we can get some luxury brands. Right, and it's something I can smile about now, but it was absolutely galling at that point. So, it really, I think the current conditions don't make these decisions any easier for an editor. I think ultimately we want to ensure that an editor is able to exercise these decisions without fearing that their next paycheck or their newsroom's next paycheck may be endangered.
I mean, I get a sense from that response as well that personalization might be the enemy of public interest, in the sense of you would historically produce content, what you're saying, for different, catering for different interests to get as broader audience, but now one can personalize everything. You can target different things to different people, so individuals may not see everything. But I suppose a question I just want to go back to, I mean, you said you are not just about a fund, you are also about ideas for sustainability. And I think you did say there's no model right now, but what are some of those ideas around building sustainability that might have promise that you are seeing?
We're thinking increasingly about national funds. We've helped to finance a national fund in Sierra Leone. Of course, it's a very small country with a very small media market, so cannot compare to the scale of what might be needed in South Africa, but a very interesting context with its own pitfalls as well. Right now, what happens when a government changes and a government doesn't feel like this is the most important thing to do anymore. But really, I think that it begins really with a whole of society buy-in to say that this is something that's important and we're going to do something about it. Similarly, we're exploring something in Brazil along these lines. We're, of course, trying to think about, SANEF has documented its ideas for for some kind of fund here in South Africa. So I think that one of these things that we are trying to grapple with is a national fund, and it will certainly not be, the cutter, to make the cookie in every country, but I think it has some interesting promise in certain contexts at a certain level. I think that's something, but of course the question is, where's the funding for this fund going to come from? And this is why, I think this is the more interesting question, is, whether it, becomes some kind of public subsidy or, some kind of, public financing of this, or is it that, there's some kind of World Bank mechanism that feeds this? There are many permutations that I don't think that we have the answer. Right now, the national funds that we're exploring really are trying to respond to the immediate emergency, to ensure that we're able to get financing at scale to to a wide breadth within a certain jurisdiction. But in time, I can see how the objectives of these funds will obviously have to change, and we then also have to think about where the future funding for that comes from. As the international fund, we're only meant to exist for the next 10 to 15 years. We're an ambitious lot of people who think that we're going to solve this in the next 10 years and then retire. So the clock, I think, is ticking, but the point is that the international fund is in and of itself not the solution. It really is, the stopgap emergency measure powered as well with the ideas and recommendations and policy support for the future. So, these kinds of, I think this is really, really important. I think another important, systemic change, that we're looking at is also reframing the relationship between news media and technology companies as well, and trying to find ways of ensuring that there is a more equal exchange of value, especially with the dawn of generative AI and what that might bode for the future of news media. There's, no one knows exactly how that might turn out. We're seeing organizations like The Guardian have basically stopped the crawling of its website. But that has profound consequences. So we can't advise South African news media organizations to say, hey, switch off, your indexing because OpenAI or whoever is just going to crawl it. Because we're also, the other thing that, we might have is that these organizations are, again, all based in so-called global north, will then have a predominantly northern view of the world. So, the chatbots that emerge will then not be informed, for example, by South African experience or South African information. So, these are some of, reframing technologies, a relationship with news media. Again, I don't know what the answer might be there, but some level of reframing and working together with with both parties, I think is essential as well.
Well, I was interested with, just in that context, your comment earlier about the need to align the objectives or incentives. Do you see a way through to that?
I'm wondering how optimistic I am. I've just come back from leave, so maybe I'm more optimistic than I should be. I think that it is in the best interests of any business whether it is technology or otherwise, for there to be a thriving independent media in the countries which they work. I think Professor Joseph Stiglitz has said this best. There's a paragraph that I have lying around somewhere where he speaks about how business needs media. And I think that's exactly it, that we're not adversarial, but rather that as much as these technology companies come here to make money, they need to understand the country as well. And if we're not here to help them understand the country, they will be able to make less money. Their risks will be greater. So I think that it is in the best interests of technology companies who continue to have a business interest in South Africa to ensure that there is a thriving independent media.
I mean, I suppose, not to skirt around the elephant in the room, I mean, Meta doesn't seem to think so, given its deprioritization, or at least not think for itself if it's pursuing other objectives. So maybe that is they might say they have a business, and their business is in fact not the public interest media. Their business is community, rather than that. So are you saying almost, yeah, if there isn't public interest media and democracy is undermined, the pie and the economy is going to be a lot smaller, and you all have an interest in making sure.
Exactly that. And that is what is at stake. I think that Facebook's decisions are ultimately short-sighted, and I think are very sad for the flow of information in places like South Africa, where most people are using Meta products like WhatsApp or Facebook to experience the internet. And I hope that in time that's a decision that they might revisit.
Maybe just a couple of last ones from me. Oh, you good? I mean, in this global fund and debate, you mentioned something in Sierra Leone, Brazil, and you're working across the globe. How do you think Africa and South Africa differ, and what should at least we make sure we understand in trying to locate some of that global debate with a local lens?
First of all, I think that South Africa is quite distinct from other parts of Africa at the moment, especially in the interrogation of this relationship here. I know in Kenya there's the beginning of some work on this, but they're further away. But I think that we're similar in in the experience, in the collective experience of this problem, in that we've all experienced the shrinkage of our newsrooms, no business model left, etc. But I think that where South Africa is quite different is that we have a particular economic context within which we're living in, a very, very sluggish economy for a number of years now, which makes doing business very, very difficult, is especially difficult for new entrants. And on top of that, we have a particular political context. And I think that is important to stress as well. We are a young democracy, and require perhaps great vigilance of our democracy because it was so hard won. And I think that for me is really, there are developments just in the last couple of weeks from elsewhere in this regard. In Indonesia, for example, some new permutations coming up in Australia. And while I think that is valuable for us to look over and understand what's happening and, of course, reframe what we're doing and how we're responding, I think that we cannot miss our own context and what we need in South Africa. And ultimately, I think that for us, I want to conclude by saying that this is the problem that we're facing is not the fact of journalists not having jobs or some or other publisher not, having a bonus, but rather the real challenge we're facing here is that most South Africans no longer have access to quality information on the platforms where they are receiving information, and that really is that is the problem. We have a young population who've probably never bought a newspaper or never waited for the 7 p.m. news. Their only experience of news is a mobile phone, and this is why we're different to Europe in that respect, in that our population is so much younger. So the stress for us really is to ensure that media is resilient enough to meet the needs of younger people as well.
Thank you for those concluding comments, and yeah, I think you're right. I mean, what I found interesting in some of the Reuters research was, like Facebook for news in the UK 17%, Kenya it's 66%, and here it's 56%. And they make the point how younger audiences, even in those countries, are consuming very differently.
Yep.
And whilst some of us older people are sticking to our traditional ways, if you look at as we move on, it's going to be a very different picture,
Exactly.
even in those countries.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So I think it is a good point. But thank you so much for your contribution, and I'm sure we, as I indicated to the previous stakeholders, we are likely to have some follow-up questions. We can't get to everything in this session, but I think you've raised some important issues for not just the panel, but the public and the media to contemplate as well as we go through these hearings.
Thank you very much. Thank you.